Hello YouTube! Today we're going to be continuing our exploration of e4, e5. We're going to be focusing on the Vienna variation today. We're going to be looking at the move knight f6, and we're going to be looking exclusively at the move bishop to c4 today, and we're going to be focusing a lot of time on the opening that shares its name with a Halloween costume. We're going to be looking at the Frankenstein Dracula variation. So, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that like button and hit subscribe. It really does help me out. So the move I'm recommending here is knight takes e4. This is an old tactic called the fork trick, and black actually wants white to capture on that e4 square because he intends to play d5, which not only gets his piece back, but ends up in a position where he has the only center pawn left standing, and this should be slight advantage black for the rest of the game. So because of that, after knight takes e4, white needs to play something to keep the position lively, and that move is queen h5. Queen h5 threatens mate on f7, and it also threatens to regain his pawn with queen captures e5. So this basically forces black's next move. Black has to defend against that mate threat by covering the f7 square and also counterattack the bishop on c4. Here, white has basically two options. He can play bishop b3, which can lead to the wild and crazy Frankenstein Dracula, or he can simply play the move queen e5, which leads to a dull, boring position with no life in it at all. After the move queen e7, white has to actually help black finish his development because black is tempoing the bishop on c4, so he's going to be forced to exchange queens and then spend another tempo retreating that bishop. Black would simply play something like c6, d4, knight f5, knight f3, d5, and if anybody's better in this position, it's black, because white has to do it through a little bit of effort to fix the bishop on b3 with moves like knight e2, c3, bishop c2. But on the whole, this position is just completely dead level. An example would be Ian Rogers versus Alexei Shirov, Salamanca 1998, which ended in a draw after 31 moves. So, going back to the position after knight to d6, the better move is just simply retreating with bishop to b3, and now it's black that has a choice. He can either go into the Frankenstein Dracula with knight c6, or he can make things extremely boring if he wants to with the move bishop to e7. Now in this case it's a little different. Since queens do remain on the board, this position should favor white a little bit. White does have two options here. White could play the move knight f3. This isn't very well respected and might lead to advantage black. A sample variation would be like this, where the king is forced to go to f1 and white's development is awkward. This should probably favor black, and did in Davensky versus Levon in Hungary in 1991, where black went on to win after 70 moves or so. Now, the alternative, of course, to knight f3 is queen takes e5, and this should lead to slight edge white, but these positions are also fairly equal because the pawn structure is once again very symmetrical. An example would be castles, queen f4, and then knight e8. Notice we don't have knight f5, d4, knight c6, and then something like this. And the pawn structure is symmetrical and the position should be equal, but if anyone's better, it's white, because black has a very awkward time finishing his development. But this still ended in a draw after 84 moves in Nakamura versus Duda in St. Louis in 2019. And that should be roundabouts the expected result. So now we're going to go back to this position after knight to d6, bishop to b3, and we're going to be taking a look at the move that leads to the Frankenstein Dracula, knight to c6, holding that pawn and basically forcing white's next move if white wants to get anything out of this position. White's going to play the move knight to b5, which threatens mate again. He's threatening knight takes d6 followed by queen f7 mate, and of course that knight on b5 is not hanging, because if we play knight takes b5, queen f7 is mate. This forces black's next move. Black has to play g6, and then white reiterates the mate threat with the move queen f3, threatening mate on f7 yet again. This forces black's next move. Black has to play the move pawn to f5, and then white threatens mate yet again. Now, when I was younger and I saw this position for the first time, I did recognize that I was losing the exchange with knight to c7, knight takes a8, because I needed to defend against the mate threat on f7, and I incorrectly played the move queen f6 and ended up losing my very first game in the Frankenstein Dracula. At the time, I didn't even know that this was an opening, I didn't know the name of it, and I didn't know the theory at all. So when I played queen f6, that was kind of my first attempt to try to figure out what to do in these positions. I now know that the move queen to e7 is quite a bit better. And what it has to do with is down the road, black really wants to play a move like e4 and e3, especially if white tries to consolidate his position by playing d3, bishop d2, and castling queenside. Black needs a way to push forward his central pawns and push his central pawn majority advantage in a way that prevents white from ever consolidating his position, because white is going to have a significant material advantage after the forced move, which is queen e7, knight c7, king d8, knight takes a8. In this position, white is essentially up an exchange and a pawn. And I remember one grandmaster said of this position, when he first saw this position, he didn't know who to feel sorry for. He didn't know if he should feel sorry for white because he's basically lost complete control of the center of the board, or if he should feel sorry for black because black is down an exchange and a pawn. Now, my personal opinion is I prefer black. Number one, I'm playing the black pieces, so I can afford to go a little bit further away from a sane position. I can play something a little crazy. But number two, I'm really biased towards the activity, and I'm biased towards the center of the board. I feel like white's problems are actually harder to solve than black's. I feel like black has solved the majority of his development and his opening problems, and I think that that's more important than the material that black is down. Even though black is down in exchange, we still have the same number of pieces on the board. So I actually prefer black in these positions, and I've played black in these positions many times, and I have a very good score in these positions with the black pieces. So black's next move is actually pretty obvious. We need to play the move b6, because we have to threaten to get our knight back at some point so that we're only down an exchange and not down a whole rook. We have to play the move bishop b7, and we have to take this knight. And at this point, white has an interesting option. He can grab this extra pawn with knight to b6, or he can leave the knight on the a8 square. Now, from a theoretical perspective, this actually doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Now, there are actually books that will tell you that it does, that capturing on b6, for example, I've actually seen some books give this an exclamation mark. In the theoretical lines, for the most part, this makes very little difference. And actually, when I was playing the black pieces in these lines, I always preferred it when they captured, because I didn't have to worry about harvesting this knight on a8 later with my bishop. So we'll go over kind of both knight takes b6, and we'll go over leaving the knight on a8 kind of all in the same go, because a lot of these ideas are very interchangeable. So the first move that white typically plays is d3, black plays bishop b7, and we're already creating threats against the white queen, because as you can see, this knight on d6 supports the b7 bishop, so we're actually threatening to trap the queen at some point with a move like knight d4. But white still has time. White can counterattack and threaten to win our queen with the move h4. Now he's threatening the move bishop to g5, which would pin our queen and king. Now the move we don't want to play here is something passive like h6. We need to get our pawns rolling towards the king, because we need to be ready to play e4 and e3 just in case white tries to consolidate his position with an idea like bishop to d2 and castles queenside. So the correct move here is pawn to f4. At this point, we are threatening to trap the queen, so the queen is going to retreat. The queen is going to play queen f3. Now please note, we are not taking a move to play bishop takes a8. This knight is probably going to hang out here for quite a while, because we have more important things to do. In these types of positions, what white is trying to do is he's trying to consolidate his position by finishing his development and castling without having any serious consequences in the middle take place. What black's job is here is to make sure that he hits hard in the middle the moment that white tries to consolidate, and he makes sure that white never quite gets his position set in place. So because of that, we don't typically spend time taking this knight on a8, and that's also the reason why the knight takes b6 lines versus leaving the knight on a8. There's not a lot of independent value in both lines if you know your theory with black, if you're patient and you leave that knight on a8. So here, you would play a move like knight d4, and now there are two moves here, and there is independent value to both of these two moves. And of course, there's independent value to both of these two moves, whether white plays the knight takes b6 line or leaves the knight on a8. And those two moves are queen to g4 and queen to h3. So the first move we're going to cover is queen h3, because this is a little bit more straightforward. Queen g4 is quite possibly a better move, because queen g4 is a slightly better place for that queen. But queen h3 is played probably just as often. So queen h3, we're going to play bishop h6. The idea is to hold that pawn on f4 so we can play e4 and e3 by the time white gets set in place and castled. White will usually play bishop t2 with the idea of castling so that we're going to play e4, e3. Notice again, we're not spending time to take that knight. I can't emphasize this enough. We don't have time to do it. If we take a move to take that knight, we're not going to be in time to play e4 and e3 when we need to make sure that white doesn't consolidate. So here, white, you play e4 before white's castled. White's going to castle, and then we're going to play e3. Please note that taking here on e3 with the f-pawn would be completely suicidal. After the recapture, the bishop moves, we would play e2 check, and we're hitting the king, we're hitting the rook, and we don't even have rook d2 because e1 equals queen would, of course, win the game. Or we could even play e1 equals rook at that point and would win the game. We can't take that pawn. So we're going to have to just move our bishop out of the way. This allows e2, which is putting pressure on the rook, and we're still creating a discovered threat against the king with the bishop on h6. At this point, this position is advantage black. We do have to follow up correctly, though. So after the move rook to e1, we're going to play the move bishop to g2, threatening the queen, and if queen takes g2, we have f3 check winning the queen. That forces white's next move, queen h2, and now finally, since we have nothing better to do, yes, we can finally do it, we can play bishop takes a8. Now when I was younger, this was always my favorite move of the whole continuation, was playing bishop takes a8. Not only do I finally get a chance to capture that knight, I set up the possibility of playing what one person referred to as the rarest move in chess, moving your bishop from one corner of the board all the way to the other. Unfortunately, I misplayed this a lot when I was younger. After a move like, say, king to b1, I used to play the very incorrect move, bishop takes h1, just because I was in such a hurry to play this super rare move. The rook on h1 isn't doing anything, and as a matter of fact, I've probably thrown away my advantage. After queen takes h1, king c7, queen d5, white is getting firm control of the light squares with his queen and bishop, and at this point it's starting to have a totally reasonable position. So correct is not bishop to h1 after king b1, it's to leave this poor helpless rook on h1 and simply protect my e-pawn with a move like rook e8. And then take full advantage of the fact that we're going to be able to create two very dangerous passed pawns. Because white has probably nothing better than to play a move like f3. There's also a possibility of c3, in which case we would plant our knight on f3, and these positions should be advantage black as well. After a move like f3, we would simply take it. We would take. They would manage to save their rook, but actually these rooks are more of victims to these two passed pawns than helpers. We're eventually going to be able to play f3 and f2, and we're going to have a huge advantage. The main thing that we have to do is we need to get rid of these temporary pins, and black will have a huge advantage. So a sample would be something like queen e5, king c7, takes, queen to h5, and now finally we can simply play f3, and when they come back to attack that knight again, we bring our queen back, and then those two f and e-pawns are mobile, and black has a huge advantage here, even though he never did get back his exchange. So that's one sample variation on how we would have a huge advantage, and that works extremely well against the move queen to h3. That's the basic plan. We're going to play e4 and e3 at that right moment when they get ready to castle queenside, and that should be some kind of advantage. So the only other continuation that's really worth mentioning here after knight to d4 is the move queen to g4. Now what's really interesting here is it's not clear exactly what the best line is. We could follow in the same guise and we could play the move bishop to h6 with the idea of meeting bishop to d2 with e4, e3. Now in this case, this is a little different because the queen on g4 is going to eventually put some pressure on this knight on d4, and because of that, we're going to have to insert the move knight takes b3, which makes these positions slightly less appealing than the other positions, and makes the final positions maybe a little bit more unclear and not just straight up advantage black. So an example would be bishop d2, we would play e4, same idea, we're trying to get in e3, castles queenside, e3, but in this case fe3 is a very workable idea, because if I play fe3, my knight on d4 is hanging, and when queen takes the knight on d4, the queen is also putting some pressure on the rook on h8. This is a completely different story. I have to insert the move knight takes b3, ab3, takes, and now this bishop can simply retreat to the e1 square. We can play pawn to e2, and then rook to d2, And this position is unclear after, we'll say, Rook E8, Knight H3, and then finally we harvest this knight on A8. And we're just going to classify this position as unclear. It seems like black can get his exchange back at any time, but black's position is still pretty messy. So the alternative to this kind of traditional looking bishop h6, and of course you can still do this, there is an alternative. Now, what's interesting about the alternative is the alternative has never really been tried. And the move that I'm going to recommend here is either bishop takes a8 right away, followed by h5, or possibly h5 right away. And I'm not sure which one of those is better. But I'm leaning towards bishop takes a8 right away. And then after, say, bishop to d2, I think we should try the move pawn to h5. Now, in the past, this position has come up, and nobody has tried the move pawn to h5, instead opting for something like knight on 6 to f5. But this seems to lead to advantage white. We don't seem to be jumping on this position fast enough to keep white from consolidating. So I think we should play pawn to h5, and this looks really, really interesting. If white retreats with something like queen h3, we can continue with our normal set of plans with a move like bishop h6, and this actually looks perfectly acceptable, if not even a little bit better than the other variations, because we've managed to lock up this side of the board and cover that g4 square permanently. It cost us the tempo, but that's actually a small price to pay. So the only other continuation is queen takes g6, and then I recommend something really entertaining. We can play the move Rook H7 with the idea of the move queen to g7. So what we're going to do here is we're going to exchange queens, which seems anti-intuitive since we're down in exchange. But what we're doing is we're putting an enormous amount of pressure on the g2 square before they've had a chance to consolidate their position. And they have no real way to defend it. So after, say, knight e2, we're going to play something like bishop takes g2, and the position is bad enough for this rook that they have no choice but to take this knight. So for example, rook g1, knight f3 would be super powerful, for example. So they're going to have to play knight takes d4. We're going to simply rip that rook. They're going to castle queenside. We're going to rip the knight. They're going to rip the bishop. And this position is unclear, but probably really close to equal. White has two very nice slicing and dicing bishops that I like very much. Black's pawn structure looks a little awkward, but we still have the same number of pawns. But also black has access to the main open file on the board right now, which is the G file, and he has access to the G2 square. So I'm going to classify this position as unclear and possibly equal, and certainly a position worth exploring. It is worth exploring the idea of playing the move h5 in this position instead of the old theory, which is knight on 6 to f5. Okay, so this is basically how you play the Frankenstein Dracula with the black pieces, and I hope that you can use this variation in your own games to good effect and that you understand the ideas here, and I hope that this video was helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.